Good morning, everybody. I'm going to begin this morning with reading the scripture of Matthew 28, verses 1 through 10. And I'm going to read it in the King James because that's my favorite, and also because I think that's where from which we extract the saying for this weekend, he is risen. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and became as dead men. And the angel answered and said unto the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay. And go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him. Lo, I have told you. And they departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy, and did run to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, All hail. And they came and held him by the feet and worshiped him. Then said Jesus unto them, Be not afraid. Go, tell my brethren that they go into Galilee, and there they shall see me. Our dear Heavenly Father, Almighty God, dear Jesus, thank you for this day and for every day of our lives. Give us open minds and hearts as we study together. Amen. I will say just a few words about David Trim. Many of you have probably viewed the video already of his talk at the conference last October at Andrews. David Trim was born in Bombay or Mumbai, India, of missionary parents, and he was brought up in Australia. He earned a BA in history from Newbold College and a PhD also in history from King's College London. King's College also happens to be the alma mater of three other Adventist scholars well known to our class. These include Bert Holoviak, Kendra's father, Zach Plantak, and of course, Reinder Brunsma, who has spoken to us several times. Dr. Trim has an impressive curriculum vitae, which includes visiting fellowships at the Huntington Library, at the Shakespeare Folger Library, as at UC Berkeley, and the University of Reading in the UK. He has edited or co-edited at least 10 books and published some 150 or more scholarly and popular articles. He's been a professor of history for extended periods at Newbold College and at Pacific Union College, where he held the Walter Utt, another famous historian, chair in Adventist historian, chair of history. This year, Dr. Trim was elected a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in the UK. So we are anxious to hear him this morning.
Thank you, Donna. And I'll begin sharing. And can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Minutes to, in some way, embrace the entire conference and summarize some of the ideas, especially for those of you who have not been here, but also to try to make a collective of what we have heard and start for a conversation on that topic. After his presentation, there will be about 20 minutes for Q&A for his own presentation, and I encourage all of you who are still either in here or online to send those questions to Dr. Trim during his presentation, and you can do that on Adventist Identity at andrews.edu. After that, we will have about 40 minutes time to discuss all the presenters' contributions. So if there are still people that would like to actually address some issues from different papers, or even more collectively ask questions for most of the presenters that are still with us, we would be delighted to have that opportunity. Maybe 10 minutes of this last session before 7 o'clock, we will open up, unlike in any other session so far, a kind of microphone here in the room for those who might want to still get engaged in asking or maybe asking secondary questions, or even for presenters to ask each other questions. So this will be unusual, but we hope that this will be helpful in the process that we are holding together. So let me introduce to you the speaker for the evening. Dr. David Trim has a BA from Newell College and a PhD from King's College in London. We have that in common, both of those things. He's the author and co-author or editor of 13 books and has also published over 80 articles, scholarly papers, and book chapters. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and since 2010, he has served as a director of the Archives, Statistics, and Research for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Actually, just this last week, he has been appointed for further minimum 3 years. I don't know whether that's the span or 5 years, but we are delighted that Dr. Trim, who has been also an organizer and one of the leaders for the conference, is going to speak to us now.
Sorry. Thank you, Zach. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the indispensable role played by John Reeve and the Church History Department here at the seminary. John has been a titan, being involved in all the logistical arrangements, but he's also been personally involved in all the fielding and sorting of questions that have taken place. For this final session, he's actually in the room with us, as opposed to dealing with questions. He's left that to his graduate students. But John, please would you stand and let's give John a hand. It's been a pleasure to work with the Church History Department, and also let me acknowledge the fellow sponsorship of this conference, not only by the Office of Archives, Statistics and Research, but also by the Ellen G. White Estate and by the Biblical Research Institute. And we're very grateful to all of those partners in the conference that has eventuated. How can I do justice in a little more than half an hour to 30 papers, many of them very substantial, several in excess of 12,000 words? With even the condensed presentations taking up 10 sessions over 3 days? The answer is I cannot. Inevitably, my summary of the conference is bound to be a partial and partisan one. Please note that I have drawn on full papers, not just the presentations, except where the paper was not submitted in advance. I have singled out some themes that struck me as significant, recognizing that someone else would find different themes and papers worthy of comment. I also want to note that I enjoyed and learned from every paper, and if I fail to mention someone, it should not be taken as being silent criticism of their paper. It's just that it didn't make it into my writing process. And I hope that this very personal reflection on what we have learned about Adventist identity, or perhaps I should say what I have learned about Adventist identity from this conference, I hope that this personal reflection prompts those listening here in the seminary chapel, or those watching on the live stream when we have more than 1,500 people registered for the live stream. I hope it prompts you to think again in a different way, perhaps even a deeper way, about some of the points that have emerged from the intellectually rich feast that we have been treated to since Thursday night. As the organizing committee set out to shape this conference on Adventist identity, we chose to structure it around the different ways that Seventh-day Adventists have historically had of constructing our identity. You can see that in the different panels that we put together. While doctrine is an obvious way we have had of defining ourselves, praxis has also been important. At various times, an Adventist has been someone who kept the law of God, someone who fervently believed in and actively supported mission to Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania, or someone who sent their child to an Adventist school, or someone who lived healthfully. And people who did not do those things have at various times been regarded as not being a good Adventist. Yet not all of these practices have been constants, either chronologically or geographically. And other examples could be added. Meanwhile, even the ways of defining ourselves that we agree on in principle themselves sometimes require definition. But how we define them is not always the same in every part of the world. Perhaps the only constants in our experience have been certain beliefs as opposed to practices. I suspect that what geographically are and chronologically have been constants are that a Seventh-day Adventist is someone who believes in the seventh-day Sabbath and in the literal premillennial second coming of Jesus Christ. After all, if someone didn't believe in those things, then in the most literal sense, they would not be a Seventh-day Adventist. Associated with these beliefs, though, and surely an Adventist constant, is belief in the importance of apocalyptic prophecy, which includes belief in the significance of the three angels' messages and conviction that Seventh-day Adventists are the remnant. Yet what does it mean to be the remnant? The question is an even more pressing one, since even those few core markers of identity that I have just mentioned have been practically applied differently at different times and in different places. Felix Cortez observes that the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees was not over whether the Sabbath should be observed, but how it should be observed. When I was a boy in Sydney, Australia, an Adventist, or so it seemed to me, was someone who didn't swim on Saturdays, no matter how stinkingly hot the weather. And it was certainly someone who didn't throw or kick a football around on Sabbath. As a child, these seemed crucial markers of what set us as the remnant apart. Certainly someone who swam or played sports on Sabbath couldn't be a good SDA. Yet when I arrived as a student at Newbold College, I discovered that for some European Adventists, an Adventist could kick a football around on Sabbath as long as they didn't play to score goals. But in case you think those young people were unacceptably latitudinarian, I also learned that for some of them, mushrooms as well as meat were unacceptable foods, because fungi are not fruits, grains, seeds, or nuts, and they are not specifically listed as clean in Leviticus. For those young people and their families, the restaurant option of a portobello mushroom steak, popular with many Adventist vegetarians, would have seemed like an unacceptable compromise with a crucial part of Seventh-day Adventist identity. All right, the danger in discussing, as I have just done, the ways in which Adventist identity has been mutable and variously constructed is that it can give rise to a postmodern style view that there is no core Seventh-day Adventist identity. I do not think that is true. And Jiří Moskala's paper is valuable in its concept that Adventist distinctiveness is effectively defined by, quote, one, our relationship to God, and two, our following of God's revealed instructions, his teaching. A stress on the latter, I suggest, is immediately more true of Adventism than it is of general Protestantism, and thus is arguably distinctive, though a number of the points that Dr. Moskala describes also apply to other Christians. However, I certainly believe that, in Dr. Moskala's words, there are distinguishing characteristics and qualities of Adventist identity, yet even his interpretative schema has to be unpacked and can in certain respects be understood in different ways. And so what I also want to highlight is how, in thinking about our identity, we have to be ready to put aside some of our preconceptions. Because what I grew up with as being quintessentially Adventist is not in every respect what good church members at other times and places experienced or understood as a mark of faithful membership of the remnant. Thus, just as Dr. Cortez showed in his paper that there were many Judaisms, so there are multiple Adventisms. Or, as Ante Jeronchitz puts it in his paper, Adventist identity is manifold. And that is not necessarily a problem, since different definitions or constructions of identity do not have to contradict each other. They can overlap with each other or be mutually consistent. And I may say what this diversity of understanding highlights is the need for a conference such as this, which interrogates historically as well as theologically, or we might say descriptively as well as prescriptively, what has been Seventh-day Adventist identity. Let us now turn to the identity markers which have been examined in this conference, and as I say, it's been structured around them in the different panels. Let's talk about what emerges important. Given the title of this conference, Being the Remnant, only one theme can be my starting point: belief that Adventists constitute the prophetic remnant of Revelation. Now, Petrus Bahadur and Abner Hernandez gave us the long-term history, the back history of belief in the remnant. And Abner's paper, for example, notes that the Swiss Brethren, one of the sects within the Phissiporus Anabaptist movement, also identified themselves as the remnant. Rather closer to our own period, Dennis Kaiser showed that the Millerites had already started to see themselves as a faithful remnant of Christian believers even before 1844. As Kaiser, Clinton Warleen, and Alberto Tim point out, for those Millerites who became Seventh-day Adventists, the sense of prophetic identity and of being a small band was heightened by their experiences in the late 1840s and the 1850s. Partly due to the writings of Ellen G. White, they came to define themselves as the remnant. It is noteworthy that their terms for themselves included the little flock and God's peculiar people, which both point to the sense of being a limited and exclusive group, in theological terms, though not evangelistic or missiological ones. Conviction that Seventh-day Adventists were the remnant was not based only on apocalyptic texts, but also on the Sabbatarians' identification of themselves as commandment keepers, which lent credence to the self-understanding of themselves as the remnant as described in Revelation 12:17 and 14:12. But interestingly, as Dr. Kaiser also shows, with increasing maturity, the doctrine of the remnant became less reactive. Adventists became more comfortable in their own identity. Now, in practice, Sang-Hoon Ji shows that there are multiple ways of interpreting the remnant. This brings us back to multiple Adventisms. Though Dr. Ji problematized all but one of the different interpretations that he surveyed, highlighting that not all interpretations are equally valid. But in any case, there is no doubt that most Adventists are confident that, in the words of Dr. Moscala, Adventists as the eschatological remnant movement have been entrusted with the end-time message summarized in Revelation 14:6-13. And there is no doubt, too, that this is a distinctive part of our identity. It is even, as Neil Schofield points out, part of Adventist artistic identity, present in visual storytelling that helps to solidify and buttress Adventist identity. And it is to storytelling that I will turn next. Now, this is something I hadn't thought of as being important in identity formation before we began preparing for this conference. But I now want to tentatively suggest that our shared narratives may be the most important of all the ways by which our Adventist identity is constructed. I say this because it affects many of the others. And I also suggest this because the stories we tell appeal to our hearts and affect us in ways that perhaps doctrines which appeal to the head do not. We could say, for example, that Adventists are people who read the same stories in church publications or hear them told in Sabbath school or church. Very often mission stories, as Ashley Chisholm showed us in her moving paper. But not always, and perhaps increasingly less so than in the past. Stories of Ellen G. White are a great staple of Adventist identity. But what other stories are Adventist constants? And who gets to decide which individual narratives become part of the wider Adventist narrative or meta-narrative? Ante Juroncic's point highlighted that storytelling is an essential force in identity configurations, and that human identities are always narrative identities. They are always narrative identities. And it seems to me that one of the points to emerge from Neil Schofield's visually and intellectually rich paper is that storytelling can be done visually through artistic representation, as well as orally or through documents. And implicit in Clinton Warlin's paper is that storytelling can be done through song. And one of the implicit points, as I take it, of Valentina Kuryliak's very original paper is the extent to which historical memory is transmitted through narratives without which there is no collective memory. Memory, as she argues, thereby shapes identity and thus the Adventist present and future as well as the past. However, the title of Dr. Cortez's paper reminds us that narratives can be in conflict. And Dr. Juroncic rightly asks, whose storytelling of a story should we attend to? Whose account should we count as normative? After all, when narratives collide, often one version will emerge as triumphant, sometimes superseding another narrative. We see that in our own history. Some stories get told and retold, but as Kevin Burton showed us, others get dropped from our common story, reshaping the Adventist meta-narrative and thus molding SDA identity in certain ways. For example, in practice, Adventist identity was redefined from being socially and politically radical and racially inclusive in the 19th century to being socially and politically conservative in the 20th century and racially prejudiced for much of that century. Perhaps our biblical conservatism in an era of rampant theological liberalism made us more susceptible to the blandishments of fundamentalism and political evangelicalism, even though our apocalyptic scenario foretells that it is the religious zealots who will persecute Sabbath keepers. This is not the end of my remarks about the importance of story, as I will come back to narrative in talking about some other factors that distinguish and construct our identity. But first, how do we explain the variety of stories we tell? Partly the influence of wider society, as in the example I just gave, but another answer would be worldview. Judd Lake quotes the philosopher Hunter Mead, arguing that a worldview is either an articulated system of philosophy or a more or less unconscious attitude towards life and the world. And I single this out because it seems to me that both of Mead's either-or options arguably apply to Adventism. It is both an articulated system of philosophy and a more or less unconscious attitude toward life and the world. It is, at least in theory, and actually and I will go say more than that if listening to John Peckham, for example. It is an articulated system of philosophy. And as Lake puts it, it is a holistic message that integrates all of thought and life. I would add that the great controversy theme is a distinctive undergirding meta-narrative, a point to which I will return. Yet Adventism is also, I would argue, to some extent, to come back to that definition, a more or less unconscious set of attitudes towards life in the world. In this sense, it is the fruit partly of the stories we tell, which is one reason I treated narrative ahead of worldview. If I have a problem with Dr. Lake's erudite analysis, it is that he focuses too much on Adventist worldview as a unified system of thought and a package of doctrines, and not enough on Adventism as a collection of shared narratives and experiences. There is another point about the Adventist worldview, which is that, in the words of the Christian philosopher James Alpheus, also quoted by Lake, it is, like other Christian worldviews, communal in scope and structure rather than held only by individuals. It binds its adherents together into community. Here we come again to the importance of story, which includes Bible stories as well as Adventist stories, in structuring shared presumptions, though in the Adventist case, doctrine and practice also help to form a collective worldview, and thus a communal identity. Lake rightly stresses the potential of secular stories, especially those expressed through cinematic, televisual, and social media, to gradually, imperceptibly, quote, reshape a believer's worldview into its own mold, thereby extinguishing the Christian worldview, end quote. This has disturbing implications for Adventist identity. But one is that while Adventist identity has to be defended in strictly theological terms, we also need to think in terms of its shared experiences, as Ante Jeroncic posits, and its shared stories, though I want to stress that the latter include the stories of Scripture engaged with in personal and group Bible study. Dr. Jeroncic astutely asks, what is necessary for us to engage in faithful storytelling, not subject to predetermined cultural molds and expectations? This strikes me as a key issue for Adventist identity in the 21st century. What is necessary for us to engage in faithful storytelling, not subject to predetermined cultural molds and expectations? The communal nature of worldview points to the communal nature of identity, which Dr. Jeroncic highlights, concluding that the perfection of Christ resides not in any single individual, but as a collective reality. Yet community can be destroyed by theological controversy. Based on his reading of Second Temple Judaism, Dr. Cortez warns of the danger of an environment of conflict. It tends to focus our attention on those things that differentiate us from competing parties without regard to the central or marginal nature of those things. Issues that were not important for a movement at its origin can eventually become defining elements of their identity because those issues differentiate them from their competitors. Abner Hernandez, in his paper, shows how controversy tore Protestantism apart. He also shows the significance of dueling confessions of faith in entrenching different identities and engendering hostilities. Of course, all Adventists, or almost all, would agree that there are some things that cannot be compromised on. But perhaps part of the fact that there are multiple Adventisms is that not all would agree on what those non-negotiable things are. Yet, having accepted that there are points on which concessions cannot be made, perhaps they are relatively limited in number. In any case, rather than looking for points of difference, we could look for those things we have in common. And such an approach might in and of itself help to resolve some of the things we theologically debate, holding them as being essential parts of Adventist identity or not. A different mindset might help us to avoid the fate of the 16th century Protestants examined by Dr. Hernandez. At the start, I suggested a few distinctives that have marked and shaped Adventist identity virtually everywhere and every when in our history. These include the sanctuary, examined by Goran Zivkovic, and touched on, I may add, by Dick Davidson and Clinton Wiley, and the Sabbath, which was addressed so richly and diversely by Joanne Davidson, Michelle Lee, and Gavin Anthony. There is an obvious Adventist distinctive, however, that I did not mention in my opening remarks, the great controversy theme. As John Peckham shows, from our inception, Adventists have possessed the framework of a most beautiful and coherent system of truth. Surely at the center of that system is Jesus Christ, a point to which I shall return in a moment. But also there is the great controversy theme, which Jerzy Moskala identifies as a key to right understanding of God's character and thus as an important insight into the overall biblical theological teaching. While, as Valentina Kuryliak argues, the idea of the great controversy affects all Adventist doctrines which take on a pronounced Adventist flavor and do not remain exactly the same as general Christian teachings. Moskala calls this an Adventist meta-narrative, and he is joined in that characterization by Judd Lake. But what is a meta-narrative? Now, in Dick Davidson's reading, a scriptural meta-narrative is merely a grand central theme. Lake and Kuryliak cite works in which a Christian meta-narrative is simply a central organizing principle or a theological center to scripture and reality. In this view, meta-narrative is chiefly intellectual and instrumental rather than primarily narrative and affective. Yet it is striking, I think, though something we lose sight of, that the great controversy theme is anchored in story. In a series of narratives, starting with Lucifer's defiance of the Creator, continuing with all that flowed therefrom, including many other compelling stories, from the fall through to, most important of all, the gospel story. Thus, the great controversy is more than theodicy. It's even more than a theological master key. It is a story, or rather a set of interconnected stories. And it surely is its nature as a set of narratives that helps to explain the great controversy theme's power to move hearts, as it has done for a century and a half since Ellen White first expounded it. It is a meta-narrative in the sense of a foundational story, as well as of a grand unifying theme. And as such, it is a non-negotiable, a sine qua non of Adventist identity. I come back to Valentina Kuryliak's comment that I quoted a moment ago, that Adventist doctrines take on a pronounced Adventist flavor and do not remain exactly the same as general Christian teachings. This is true of another aspect of Adventist identity, and another that I didn't mention at the start of this presentation, namely our doctrinal understanding of Jesus Christ our Lord. I so appreciated Dick Davidson's paper, which demonstrates the centrality of Christ to all Adventist doctrines, while the Christological Center also emerged from Ante Juroncic and Gavin Anthony's papers. Of course, Christ is central to doctrine for nearly all Christian churches. But our understanding, in both our eschatology and soteriology, of the great controversy theme and of the significance of the sanctuary, mean our understanding of Christ is not the same as that of every other denomination. Nevertheless, what is perhaps most important is that, in words of Ellen G. White, quoted in the papers of Davidson, John Peckham, and Alberto Tim, Adventists believe Christ, his character and work, is the center and circumference of all truth. He is the chain upon which the jewels of doctrine are linked. This centrality also emerges from Neil Schofield's survey of Adventist eschatological artwork and Davidson's analysis of the early Seventh-day Adventist print, Christ, the Way of Life. But perhaps we should say that at its best, Adventist theology teaches the centrality of Christ, and this understanding should be core to Adventist identity. But Davidson's closing remarks suggest he fears that this is one of the points on which there are multiple Adventisms. And there have certainly been times historically when the law, rather than Christ, was at the center of Adventism. Ellen White's words that I just quoted were written in an attempt to change that. Perhaps Davidson's paper is best conceived of as partly aspirational, or alternatively prescriptive rather than descriptive of how Adventist identity universally actually is or has been. Let us turn to one of the aspects of our Adventist identity that I did touch on at the start, Adventist lifestyle. And here we do move away from narrative. Valentina Kuryliak had an insightful comment in her conclusion. She argues that Adventist identity is not only a complex and balanced structure of theological ideas, but it is also a specific lifestyle of believers associated with it. Once, lifestyle would have meant chiefly food and drink, with dancing and movie-going coming into the mix. But now we have to include LGBTQ issues, the subject of Nicholas Miller's paper. Miller rightly stresses that the Adventist position on such issues is biblical. And though we share that with some other Christians, Adventists, with our creation stance, may stress more than some other Christians that sex and gender identity is founded in our being created in the image of God as both male and female. We don't have data, but anecdotally I would say that the church's official position on sex and gender is so widely accepted around the world, save for a tiny, though vocal minority, that the official position can be said to be part of Adventist identity, albeit one that is not hugely important simply because most Adventists take the official position so much for granted that they don't think about other possibilities. But in the world we live in, that's going to change, and so we need to be clear about this part of our identity. When we come to healthy living, the subject of David Williams's paper, we come back to multiple Adventisms. Dr. Williams helpfully reviewed the latest evidence about the benefits of a plant-based diet and total abstinence from alcohol. The latter, along with refraining from tobacco use, is probably a constant, chronologically and geographically, though there is a little more use of alcohol than of tobacco. But Williams then highlighted the results from the 2018 Global Church Member Survey that while the majority of Seventh-day Adventists express theoretical support for the church's teachings on diet, they combine it with being comfortable in picking and choosing which aspects to follow. In practice, vegetarianism is a minority practice within Adventism. We do not have evidence about whether this has always been the case, but certainly a plant-based diet cannot be said to be part of Adventist identity in the present, despite repeated encouragement by the organized church. What is interesting is the high proportion of church members who, as Peter Chinchala and Dwayne McBride point out, view lifestyle matters through the lens of law, and who believe that healthy living is necessary for salvation. While that percentage was less than half, it was 47%, which is disturbingly high. This belief is part of Adventist identity for a significant portion of Seventh-day Adventists. Strikingly, Williams concluded that healthier living in general, and not just wider adoption of a plant-based diet, but healthier living in general, would enable SDAs to fulfill their God-ordained mission more effectively. Perhaps if healthy living were more often connected to mission as opposed to the law, Adventists would live even more healthfully. For now, diet remains an instance of there being multiple Adventist identities. Another example is in the area of Adventist education. I will come to that in a moment, but first let me observe that one aspect we had hoped to treat in this conference was not just Adventist education as such, but the way Adventists value education, the way that Adventists are people who value study. In the end, we weren't able to find a speaker to address this theme, so if any of you wants to volunteer to write the chapter for the book, we'll be glad to hear from you. But this theme does emerge in some other papers. For example, in Dr. Moscala's stress on how our identity depends on our knowledge of Christ, on his teaching, and on our relationship with him, all of which means we can only know him fully on the basis of the Holy Scriptures. Thus, Adventists are necessarily reading people, students of the Scriptures, and of the works of others who study the Scriptures. But are we people who send our children to denominational schools? John Wesley Taylor shows us that when it comes to Adventist education, there isn't a simple arc from Adventists are people who send their children to Adventist schools to a lack of belief in Adventist education. That does more or less describe the trajectory in North America, but it certainly isn't true in some parts of the world, where to be an Adventist is still to be someone who sends their children to an Adventist school. Meanwhile, in contrast, in other parts of the world, Adventist education has never been significant. But what Dr. Taylor shows is that in any case, many early Adventists were skeptics of the value of denominational education. He quotes the view of some in 1872 that founding a school was a denial of our faith in the soon coming of Christ, and that church education would all end in formality and spiritual death. It is salutary to be reminded of this, but it may also be grounds for optimism. If there was once a trajectory away from skepticism to widespread support, could there not be in some parts of the world an arc away from widespread apathy about church schools back to ardent affirmation? One hopes so. The papers of Merlin Burt and Ted Levterov on Ellen G. White and her place in the development and construction of Adventist identity highlight again the importance of stories. In practice, we have to acknowledge that there is some disagreement about the exact nature of Ellen G. White's prophetic ministry, even among those who defend her status as a prophet. Here is another example of multiple Adventisms. But I think it is important to affirm the pivotal nature of Ellen White's ministry in Seventh-day Adventist identity. Can I hear an amen to that? Her pivotal role in Adventist identity is true descriptively, since without it we literally would not be who we are today. But it is also true normatively. And if that continues to be a strong part of our identity, perhaps the disagreements might be resolved. So I think we need to continue to affirm that pivotal part of our identity. Well, thank you for listening so patiently. To conclude, I want as an historian rather than a theologian to make one overall point. Let me rephrase that. No Adventist is not a theologian. Every Adventist is a theologian. As an historian and as an amateur theologian rather than a professional theologian, I want to make one overall point. There is a danger into which several papers at this conference arguably fall to some extent, that, as Dr. Uronchitz puts it, we end up contrasting some past idyllic state either with a dystopian present or a feared dystopian future to come. Historians don't believe there was ever an idyllic state except in the Garden of Eden. Consider that early Adventist identity was to some extent anti-Trinitarian, and that early and mid-20th century Adventist identity was racially exclusivist, and in many parts of the world, not just North America, though that's where most attention has been. Simply because views were held in the past does not necessarily mean that we should want them to be renewed in the present or future. And I want to stress that. This is where good history is crucial, as is plain not least from Kevin Burton's presentation. Of course, where good theology can help us is to remind us that even though Adventists have always believed to some degree in progressive revelation, it does not follow that a new theological or ethical interpretation should be accepted simply because it is shiny and new, as some self-styled progressive Adventists seem to accept. We need historians to tell us what we really were like in the past, to tell us what our history actually was, so that we can fully understand where we come from and thus who we are. We need theologians to tell us what the scriptures really teach. History helps to show us what our identity was. Theology helps us to see what our identity ought to be. If this conference has shown anything, it is, I hope, that history and theology need to be equal yokemates in Adventist scholarship, and not least in understanding and defending Adventist identity. Thank you.
I suppose, David, you can sit like the rest of the people have done before.
This is the hot seat.
Yes, it's the hot seat and it's very visible, so that's good.
I have a
And while I will
suggestion.
be waiting for the questions from other people, I've prepared.
Can you
tons
just
of
pause it
questions,
for a second?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying
and
to
so
do.
I
Just bear with me
will
here.
manage to get.
Okay. Simona, since you and Monty are hosting and being shared, I want to suggest whether you think we should take our break, and then you folks can do what you are planning or hoping to do.
So we can take a break now, or do you plan to continue with this presentation, question and answers, or do we want to have our own discussion?
My proposal is that we pause the presentation and we have our own question and answer and discussion.
Okay. So then it is
Monty, do you?
11:19.
I haven't listened to the Q&A, but in the introduction to the Q&A, it sounded like it might be a pretty interesting and important part of the presentation, given the audience.
I just would like to say, I agree with that. I think that question and answer is important, given the audience. And I think ours will be as well. Jeff and I are gonna go to church right now, so we won't be here for it, but I'm glad it will be recorded, just to let you know that when we disappear, that's the reason.
That's the reason. Okay, great. Thank you. I think I agree with Monty and Donna's suggestion. Perhaps we can listen to a few of the exchanges in the Q&A from the conference, and then perhaps we can break at about 11:30-ish, 35-ish.
So I would
Go ahead.
suggest actually that we take a break now. It's 11:21. So that we have then continue with that Q&A session after the break. And then we can have maybe our own discussion after that. Because the Q&A can go a little bit longer than just 10 minutes here. My understanding is going to be quite long.
Yeah, I'm in support of that. I'd like to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to pause our recording now. It is now 11:21 on the West Coast. So let's get back together at 11:30. So 9-minute break.
Brings me the paper. So David, just a very softball question to start with. That is this. You've been someone who was deeply involved in organizing and leadership of this conference, and read and reread for the purposes of preparation of this last paper of yours that is not only summary, because you are actually arguing for certain strengths and also looking at potentially some weaknesses. But here is my question. What was the one thing that surprised you or was unexpected? I know that you talked about narrative and storytelling as important, but is there anything in this particular process that you didn't expect and it came up and was unexpected and surprising? Is there anything missing? And you mentioned one thing that is missing, that paper on importance of dealing with anti-intellectualism and, you know, education at large, being more educated and educating people. Is there anything else that you feel after the end of the conference that is also missing?
There were a couple of things that I've already addressed in my paper, but there is one that... There we go, it's back on. There were a couple of things that, but I've already dealt with them in my paper. But there's one thing that occurred to me listening over the last 48 hours as opposed to last week and the start of this week when I was working on the paper, which is that an important area of Adventist history has been addressed that is almost never addressed, and that's cultural and social history. There is almost no cultural and social history of Adventism. Adventist history is mostly historical theology. It's often very good historical theology, but it leaves out large parts of Adventist history. And Michelle Lee had an excellent paper on the lived experience of Adventists, on social history, but there's also cultural history, and think about the role of the visual arts, of music, and of verse and poetry in Adventist history, and that was well dealt with by Neil Schofield, and also, as I mentioned, addressed by Clinton Wiley and Dick Davidson. So it was, I think, a pleasant surprise to find this area of Adventist history beginning to be explored.
Thank you. Was the objective of the conference and choice of speakers guided by an apologetic agenda or for a purposeful search for our identity for the 21st century? In other words, it looked like with the subtitle, Being the Remnant, that there was already there an objective that was supposed to be apologetic. But on the other hand, a lot of papers and even your concept of aspirational papers that you outlined there seems to be more purposefully guiding us into the future. So what was the objective?
That's a great question.
That was mine.
I knew that, which is why I said it. There's been a partly apologetic agenda to the whole conference. There's no question about that, but that was always secondary. And really what we wanted was to have an honest and earnest intellectual exploration of these issues. It's a scholarly conference. We're working on a book to come out of it, and we hope that that will be read by Adventists, because we know there's a disconnect between what the scholars say on the campus of Andrews and Loma Linda and elsewhere and what church members think and read. But primarily, we wanted a proper intellectual scholarly conference. The title was not meant to sound apologetic. It was to probe what is a genuine question. What does it mean to be the remnant? And perhaps a few more papers on the lived experience of Adventists would have helped in that regard. But I do think this conference has brought a little more clarity to what it means to be the remnant.
And I understand that there will be some follow-up conferences of that sort around the divisions. You shared that with me yesterday. You want to share a little bit more about
so
that?
the plan is, as some of you know, is that there will be Adventist identity conferences in each division. Or in some there might be more than one conference, in which would use some of the speakers from this conference. Obviously not all 30 of us can travel to all 13 divisions. That would just be highly impractical. But the idea is that for each conference, there would be a few people from this first main conference, with the rest, all the other papers being filled up by local scholars, people who perhaps couldn't make it all the way to America, people of whom we aren't necessarily even aware. So the idea is that there will be Adventist identity conferences cascading from this around the divisions over the next 2 or 3 years, so that there can be similar probing and interrogation of what does it mean to be the remnant, what does Adventist identity mean, and perhaps some contextualized examination of what does Adventist identity mean here in this territory.
Thank you. And probably around the world, the storytelling and narratives will be more enriching in that whole process, I think. Is salvation by faith through grace alone an area where there are multiple Adventist identities? If so, are we not in an identity crisis over our Protestant heritage? And what should be our response, given that this appears to be a cleavage along cultural lines? That's not my question.
I think it is an area where there are multiple Adventisms to some extent. If you were to look at the global church member surveys that we did in 2013 and 2018, and the one that's being carried out now, you'll find there is no question saying, do you accept righteousness by faith? And the reason is because Adventists understand diametrically opposite things by the term righteousness by faith. So if we ask that question, we'd get 96% saying yes wholeheartedly, and it would be meaningless. And there are other areas where we deliberately haven't asked one question. We've asked a cluster of questions, because to ask just one question, people would all say, I know the baptismal class answer to that, tick, let's go on. But I do think that, at least in principle, Adventists are more united on this than we were some decades ago at the height of the justification by faith wars, if I can put it that way. And I do think there was always more diversity of opinion in Adventism, and I've written on this in the past, how people thought we were polarized between two positions, but actually there were probably 4 or 5 positions, and that each of them overlapped into the other, so that there was polarization was really only true of a few very vocal people. The church was always more united than it seemed because of the shared beliefs that there was a spectrum rather than a polarity or a dichotomy. And I think that that continues to be true, and so I don't think we face an identity crisis over that.
Thank you. Another one that is, I think, related to the 21st century agendas, I suppose, especially as it talks about social media. What kind of spiritual practices are needed to wisely extend and withhold recognition to others who claim to be Adventist in the digital age, where diverging Adventist identities are performed in front of each other on social media platforms that profit from outrage and fear?
What a great question. I have no idea.
You want to look at the question just to unpack it?
It's a great question. If I had the answer to this, then I think I could be publishing books that millions of people would buy, because I would be solving a problem of the modern world with the Twitter and Instagram world. So I'm not that wise.
But maybe the questioner, I don't know, I'm guessing, if I had that question, I would have been thinking about the recent couple of years in which there has been so many theological divides that we had, but the way the social media played during the pandemic and during the second or third round of civil rights movements in 2020 and other things, it seems that the church, the people, the members, the families have been dividing greatly through these platforms that have played publicly out in the way that, you know, we talked about vaccination or pandemic and things of that nature. Does that in any way interfere with the way that we want to talk about Adventist identity? Maybe that's not behind the questions, but I have that question.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I think it is true. I think those things did get in the way of Adventist identity because we were debating things that weren't intrinsic and inherent or essential to Adventist identity and never had been. But when it comes to this matter of Adventist identities are performed in front of each other on social media platforms that profit from outrage and fear, I take one comfort from this, which is that though it's not universally recognized, the Twitter sphere is not the real world. And it's been interesting over the last sort of 5 to 7 years. There's been a number of elections in countries where if you'd followed the trend on Twitter and Facebook, they predicted one thing. You would have predicted one result from the election. And actually, in each of them, the election went the other way because real people were not necessarily paying attention to what was on Twitter. So I do think this is a problem, and I do think it feeds polarization and conflict in the church. And it's not, I don't mean to just be frivolous about it, because I think it is a problem. But at the same time, I think perhaps it's not as much of a problem as we think, because not everybody is paying attention to what's on social media, and perhaps there's more hopeful signs than we might imagine.
Thank you. Maybe for the time's sake, I will maybe have one more question directly to you, and then I will ask some questions that both come from my notes and also from the whole page that I received for the other panelists. You're all panelists now as you are presenters at this conference. So this last question to you is a simple question. I don't think that it requires simple answer. It says, what is the key identifier to point to our Adventist future? I mean, it's kind of hugely loaded, but what is the key identifier to point to our Adventist future?
You know, I really do think that it is the stories we tell. I've become convinced of this. I became convinced of it reading all the papers, and even more so listening to all the papers. We could talk about the centrality of Christ, the great controversy in the sanctuary, and the way, in fact, that those three are actually integrally interlinked. But actually, it seems to me that if we're looking for the future of Adventist identity, the stories that we tell, including on social media, but the stories that we tell, that we listen to, they are really what define us. And so I think it behooves, many of us in this room are educators, and education is often about telling stories. And they may be very intellectual stories, or they may be shaped or molded or headed in a certain direction, but it's about telling stories. And my experience, having taught in Adventist colleges for 12 years, is that the stories are what students really listened to. And so I think it behooves us as educators to think about what we want to convey by the stories we tell. And you know, here's just one example. Ashley Chisholm's excellent paper this morning. She's my staff member, so I have to say that, but I also mean it. It was an excellent paper.
It was an excellent paper.
It really was. Here's an example of how stories affect the church. We tend to tell triumphal stories of mission. And the result is that in North America, which is still the place where most of the money will come from for reaching the rest of the world, people have concluded that the church's mission is already done, because they only hear stories about Jamaica and Zambia and Zimbabwe, where 9 and 10% of the population are Adventists. And we tell stories about 10,000 people being baptized at one time. And people in North America look around and say, well, that's not my situation here. I no longer need to care about the rest of the world. I'm only going to focus on my own little patch of the world. What we need to be telling is stories about the Middle East and North Africa and China and parts of India, where there are billions of people who've never heard of Christ, much less the Great Controversy. We need to be telling stories of mission failure and also of mission hardship, which is what Ashley did, and stories that are not, because when we tell too many stories of one kind, we do shape the way that our members and we ourselves think. I just use that as one concrete example of the power of story. And so I think if we can, all of us as church leaders, as educators, as students, as people living as church members, can think about the stories we want to tell, and tell stories that promote a holistic Adventist identity and the kinds of things that we did talk about here, the great controversy, the centrality of Christ, the importance of education, the importance of healthy living, I think that can shape us to an attractive future.
Thank you. Sub-question to that would be, where do we tell those stories when we know that things have changed so drastically in the way that we used to have much more uniform way to express certain times during the Sabbath or other times to tell those stories, or that we were reading to kids those stories from 2 or 3 books, etc.
Yes.
This is becoming a very complex issue when storytelling is really unfortunately not as driven from one place. And so how do we reinvent ourselves in the 21st century for that storytelling to be much more effective?
That's another excellent question. I mean, it's one that at the General Conference we regularly puzzle ourselves with. How do we actually reach church members? How do we convey one message? And the answer is we can't. And actually, maybe that's a strength of Seventh-day Adventism as well as a weakness. We're not the Mormons, in which everything flows from a 20-story building in Salt Lake City, and actually they outgrew their 20-story building, so now they have lots of annexes. We have a 4-story building in Silver Spring, but actually we also have 15 church headquarters around the world. But it does mean that it's difficult to set one agenda. I think it comes back to the choices that we make. I do think it's important what stories get told in, for example, the Sabbath School quarterlies, which are one of the things that most Adventists do read, and children's books. But I think, how can we be involved in making a difference in this? Think about the stories that you tell on a Sabbath. The story this morning in church was very interesting, but I felt like it was more for the adults than it was for the children. And that's probably true of a lot of children's stories. But because I don't think most children are thinking about trying to cross a thin rope across a vast gulf. I don't think that really chimed with many of their experiences. I think telling mission stories, telling stories about people who struggled but kept going because Christ was with them and they believed in Christ, and who were weak but who were transformed. There's lots of these stories. It's been mentioned, the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. They're a great resource, but there are other stories that we can tell, and there's stories about Ellen White. Some of them are familiar, but they're familiar to us. Are they going to be familiar to our 6-year-olds? My mother wrote a book when I was 5 called Tell Me About Ellen White, which was a children's book and sold very well, and actually probably helped pay for us to go to church school now that I look back on it. But I can
maybe even to Newbold.
Yeah, she was still getting royalties then. That's answer to that, and it all arose from my question to her saying, tell me about Ellen White. I hear about Ellen White in church all the time, but who was Ellen White? Tell me about Ellen White. I think we have that need to retell the stories. We can't just assume the stories that we received will be told. We have to retell them, and we have to do it in an intentional way that can promote the central parts of Adventist identity that I think we did identify in this conference.
Thank you. I'll turn now to the presenters. The question came for David, but I had a similar question that I was preparing for the presenters. So I will combine the two, and I can open it up because we have another 30 minutes. Any one of you can chime in. I'm not asking specifically question to any person, but I would like to hear maybe from one or two. If you can be brief, that would be helpful for the time that we have. So here's the question. This is my 40th anniversary of marriage this year with Lydia, and I'm truly one. We became one when we got married. We were actually 16-year-old kids when we got together in the first year of Adventist Academy. And we started going out. 7 years later, we married, and now this is our 40th year. We are one, but we do not have one identity. We do have separate identities. How can we think about a church that has one Adventist identity? I would have liked more to have Adventist identities as a title. How can we think about one church that is almost 200 years old, all around the world, when my wife and I are one, and yet we have very separate identities? She's Serbian, I'm Croatian to start with. She's female, I'm male, etc., etc. So my question to you is, because this has been in David's also summary. Some of you talk about identity that is only one Adventist identity. Some of you have talked about Adventist identities and recognize those. And the question is really from now the questioner in your, we spoke about one or more core tenets of Adventist identity. Well, in some areas you identified Adventisms. How to talk about Adventisms without falling into pluralism? Or how can we have one identity when we have this 200-year history, and even within our Adventist history, we have shut door theory that I don't believe in. I'm not an Adventist of Adventist identity in a shut door theory. I don't know if you are. So how do we deal with these Adventisms and at the same time talk about one Adventist identity? Anyone?
The only way we can not be Adventisms is to at least commonly quote or commit to or tell stories about the things that we actually hold in common.
Anyone else? Things that so do we just focus on those things that we hold in common, or do we shout things that we think differently?
We are a worldwide denomination rather than a whole bunch of national denominations because we have chosen to be. We have chosen to embrace our commonalities. And you're asking about what it is that allows us to be and to have an Adventist identity. And I just think it has to be the commitment to our commonalities.
There's one other hand. Then we'll hear from the right.
Depends how you look at that.
From my point of view.
Just an additional thought to that thought-provoking question that you placed. In the New Testament, especially in the New Testament, in the Bible in general, but in the New Testament, diversity is a given. But the call in the New Testament is always to unity. The call is never to diversity. The diversity is a given from the start. It's part of our sinful nature. And therefore the call is always to unity. Now unity, in the New Testament especially, is a unity of faith. One God, one doctrine, one baptism. But there is a plurality of gifts. And we should not confuse the talents and gifts that God has given us with a plurality of doctrine. There's only one way. It is only one Savior by whom we shall be saved, not multiple Saviors. And so that, I think, is an idea that is worthy to be explored.
Thank you. There might be another answer, but what I'm hearing is that this was another question that I had later on, so this is perfectly bringing that idea. We're talking about unity rather than uniformity, and plurality or plurality in the New Testament assumes unity, not necessarily exact uniformity, and that's the big difference in the way that we can then build on that Adventist one identity with certain tenets, and I think that, you know, most of you have addressed those beautifully. Coming to you.
Thank you. Adventist identity, as you were saying, is connected really to a story. There's a story why we are here. There's a story to what we're doing here, and there's a story of where we're going. Adventist identity answers existential questions of human life, where we've come from, what are we doing, and where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley had a hand. Oh, we'll come back to Ted.
I mean, on one level, like, this may not be, I don't know, super scholarly, but when you have ice cream, you have different flavors, but it's all ice cream. So, like,
some is gelato, some is froyo.
But it's ice cream. And so I'm thinking, if you go from that idea to the fact that there are two people in your marriage that's, you know, but you're one, and then God is three persons, but is one, so there can be Adventisms, but we have one Adventism. Like, we're all one community, even though we're different individuals within it.
With a commitment to each other.
Yeah,
just like God is committed, like I'm committed to my wife.
Our stories help define who we are. And those stories are part of that commitment. We may not always agree on how to move forward, and we may not always agree on what happened behind us or on what to do in the present, but we know that we're in it together. We're all on the salad bar. I don't know. It's something like it's something to grapple with, not necessarily to have the answers for.
Thank you. I'll have three more people. Ted, I saw then Jerry. Actually, why don't you give it to Jerry and then come back to Ted and Lisa, because that way you don't go three times around with a mic. And then I'll stop and we'll maybe open up after that. There's another question I have from the audience, and then maybe I'll open up for your own questions, comments that you want to share with each other maybe, or asking David. But in the meantime, these three are still responding to that same area of conversation. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, I think that in this context, it's important to make a difference between official position of the church and what we can find in the pews. Because I think in the pews you will have plenty of Adventisms, you know, these identities, how they see it. But then there is also like a more official stand of the church. And I think that we need to make a difference between them and also strive for that unity, you know, in plurality in that official stand.
Thank you for that. I was reflecting today when I was thinking about these questions to maybe ask or engage you in. And then I'm thinking, well, even the official statements, when I was pastoring 11 years full-time in ministry in London and surrounding areas in England, Southern Conference, I had 13 questions to ask for baptism. Now we have 28. A few years ago we had 27. At some point we had only 3. So which is the official, and when? You can look at it kind of horizontally, but vertically, historically, we have also evolved, and we need to recognize that that evolvement is part of that community understanding, self-understanding too. Even officially, we've changed sometimes. But still, I'm not challenging you, I'm just saying I was reflecting on that, and it's good to think about this.
I was about to challenge you, but Ashley kind of get a better example than me. Okay. But I think that, Zach, you and Lydia have one identity, and it's the Zach's family identity. And those of us, those of us who know you,
male-oriented. I call it the Plantac.
Yeah, the Plantac. Sorry, the Plantac's identity.
I'm equal.
But those of us who know, you know your identity. I mean, these guys cook excellently. I mean, you go once and you want to go more. With Zach are in town. So you have one identity, but you are two people that represent that identity in different ways, like you express. So I think that that's kind of how Adventism is. We are one, but we express ourselves in different ways, and that's the richness and the beauty of it. Otherwise, we'll be very boring if all are Plantacs, So we need some variety, but yeah. But you have one identity as a family, as you said, but the expression that you and Lydia gives are different expressions. And I think that's how Adventism is.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I've wondered how Ellen White would write now about curry or kimchi and things that characterize our culture now. When we do accreditation visits, we look for the application of the principle, and the principle is healthful diet. And it looks different in every cafeteria. It looks different at Spicer Adventist University versus in Indonesia versus someplace else in the world. So what is the principle? And then the cultural adaptation. And that's how our missiological stance should be as well. And I think Petrus talked about some of that. What are we going to adapt when we're working with specific populations, recognizing the context within which they are working, and that in no way compromises our identity, who we are, that we might use different methods, different adaptations, so long as we are clear about the principles and the foundations.
That is so perfect. I have a son-in-law who is Korean, and I used to do sauerkraut. Now I'm doing kimchi. And his mother, who is Korean through and through, praised it and took it with her to her home to have my kimchi, even though she is the mother in the Korean culture. So it's beautiful how we can actually also, again, grow in maturity, understanding, and still use the same, well, now Napa cabbage rather than the regular European cabbage, but still it's cabbage.
Yeah, I think there's something else to bear in mind here, which is the way that we approach others. And I did allude to this in my paper that, maybe if we have a different mindset, if we consciously search out the things that we have in common as opposed to searching for the things that we may disagree on, I think that other things may flow from that. And I think this has to be done in the spirit of Christ on the eve before his crucifixion. Christ is facing the most unbelievable challenge, the most terrible ordeal, terrifying ordeal that he can imagine. But what's he thinking of? He's thinking of his disciples, and he's thinking of those who will become the disciples of his disciples. And he prays, Father, let them be one as you and I are one. Now, I think that this is, I think we're so fond of arguing with each other that we don't pay sufficient attention to that passage in Scripture. That Christ at this point is praying for his disciples, and he specifically says, for those who will believe in my disciples, that they may be one as you and I, Father, are one. So I think we need to be, as we discuss the core areas of our identity and the areas in which we have multiple Adventisms and the areas where we wish that where we think that one is acceptable and the other isn't. We need to do it in a spirit of Christian love. We need to do it in the spirit of Christ's prayer for his disciples, that we may all be one. Because as Frank very eloquently said, the call in the New Testament is to unity. It's not to plurality, but it's a unity that's based on the love that Christ has for us and the unity that he and the Father have. I mean, that's a metaphysical concept, but it's so powerful that I can't actually begin to comprehend it. But I think if we bring that spirit to our discussions, then it will go a long way to help us.
Thank you. There is one question for all of the participants, so anyone can, and if you haven't spoken and would like to speak, I'll give you first opportunity. If you already addressed any of the questions, then you will have the secondary chance. All participating in this conference about our identity, after participating in this conference about our identity, I was left with this sincere question as well as a thought, perhaps to be defined by what God believes about us and wants, probably from us, is more important or more correct than being defined by what we believe or we know. Would anybody, in a way, it's not directly related, but there was another thing that I think as a theme kept coming, and David, you addressed that as well. What my colleague Rick Rice said in the title of his book, Believing, Behaving, Belonging. And the question is, does identity in some way get defined by beliefs, by believing, or by behavior, or by belonging? And it seems that that unity that you just addressed seems to be, and willingness to be one, the way that Jesus prayed in John 17, to be part of that belonging. And maybe the question here is it perhaps how God defined belief about us and wants is more important than being defined by what we believe or what we know? Does anybody care to comment on that question from the audience? Yes.
I think what we believe, as many of the presenters have mentioned, historically as well as to the present day, is based on our understanding of the Bible. It's a biblically based faith. So it's not simply what we believe or think or feel. I'd like to broaden it a little bit. When we think about Adventist identity, our name is really quite profound. It takes in the beginnings, which we could liken to history, and are the beginnings of our Adventist history, and our hope, our eschatology, Adventist. And so I would say all of the above. Our belief, our behavior, and our belonging are part and parcel of who we are and who we will continue to be, hopefully, because we, as I appreciate very much Gavin Anthony's paper, means being more like Jesus, which is really the essence of his prayer, being more like him, following him.
Amen.
In all of these components, essential part.
Simona, I'm wondering if this would be a good time for us to pause the recording and see if group members have a comment.
That would be a good idea, I think, too. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of good news in the survey.
Okay, so thank you for this. I think it was a very interesting way of looking at things from people who are probably thinking about Christian Adventist identity more than an average person in the church does. At least I often don't think about what makes us Adventists, because it seems like almost every single person that I know in the church has slightly different beliefs. And yet we all belong to the same church. We are part of the same body. And just like in the Bible, where Paul is talking about Church of Christ, he speaks in this metaphor of body, where different parts have different functions and look differently and act differently, but they're all part of the same thing. And I think this distinction between unity and uniformity is really important. We are not called to all believe the same things, to all look alike and think alike and believe alike and behave alike. But there are some core things that are important for us to kind of stand behind. So I would like to invite all of you to join with your comments and questions. I saw there were some in the chat, so please raise your hand and let us know, and Monty is going to make sure that we know where the queue is. And if nobody has any questions or comments, then maybe we can go back to the presentation, but I would prefer to hear from you.
All right, thank you, Simona. I'm going to remind people about the guidelines. I use one question per spot in the queue to include a brief comment and directly related follow-up questions if needed, with my priorities in the queue being first questions, as well as a gender balance in the questioners. And so I am looking to entertain a hand being raised.
Well, maybe while we are waiting for this, I would like to give you a story. So we talked about stories. So former Yugoslavia had one conference at a time. One union. And unions had several conferences, which were more or less defined by the republic in which the church was located. And when the war broke out in 1991, Croatian conference was the first one to separate and form its own union. And in doing so, I think we were the only church, and I'm talking about not Adventist, but churches in general, from Catholic and Orthodox and Baptist and Evangelical, all kinds of churches that were present in the area. Our church was the only one that separated on national lines. And so when they were talking how we are not national churches, but we are a worldwide church, I'm not always certain that this is true on the level of regular churches. There are people tend to separate themselves in some way and to associate more with those who are similar to them. And we have seen similar things in conflicts in Africa, in some other areas, where people, even though they were members of the same church, kind of separated based on national identities. And I think this is a very dangerous trend for a church that aspires and wants to be a worldwide church. And therefore, this national Christian nationalism that is becoming so very popular in the United States, I think is very dangerous for Christianity and for our church if it seeps into our midst. But I would like to hear your stories and what your thoughts about this particular item or issue.
Okay, at this point, I don't have any hands or anyone in the queue. Although
Rod.
Rod, thank you, Rod. You're on.
It's always with some apprehension within when I'm the first person to speak, but I do have a couple of thoughts, and maybe I'm in a little bit of a grumpy mood, and I apologize for that if that's how I come across. When I've gone back to Australia in recent years, I've always mentioned to the people down there that want to ask me what's happening over here in the big USA, is that the church is in good hands. You know, we have lots of smart people. We have lots of people that are researching and doing presentations. And I think of the number of published writers that we've seen in our Branson Legacy Sabbath School. I've never failed to be inspired by the work of our theologians. On the other hand, today, what I've been reminded of is responses that are centrist driven. There was nothing new that I haven't heard for 20, 30, or 40 years, the call for unity and the core beliefs. And so in that sense, I appreciated the intellectual knowledge of the speaker that we listened to. But I don't feel refreshed in any way. I don't feel necessarily hopeful in any way. I still want to know what Adventists are thinking and reading and talking about the people, the masses. I didn't hear any representation really from that at all, except through some questions that were from people that were intermediaries to a centrist organization. And so even in focusing on the core beliefs, which I'm a strong believer we need to clarify, is each one of those is interpretive. Each one of those is subject to review and revision and even grammatical change and understanding of words and phrases that we know we have been misled in. And there's some cleanup that needs to happen. So I don't know how to describe it. I saw a group of people in a pit, in a sound pit. I see people circling a pole, the same pole, and I'm grateful for that pole because I know in there is truth. There's something very valuable, but I didn't see the basis of forward movement. I didn't see an inspirational leader emerge, and I did see that theologians were marginalized. And as Dave Larson pointed out, in our core beliefs, there was no mention of the state of the dead, and there was no real mention of recent work on Revelation, for example, that is bouncing around in the Adventist community. And so maybe I expect too much from this kind of forum, but today was just a recircling of stuff that I'd heard before. I value it, but at this stage of my life, I sure look forward to those people that are inspirational.
Thank you, Rod.
And I'm sorry if that comes across a little grumpy.
Rod, your comments are, even grumpy comments are appreciated. I was kind of a little bit where I'm going to jump in because I don't see anyone else in the queue. Jump in and carry on or add on or reflect on what you were just talking about. I didn't get anything particularly new. I guess what raised up for me was just, again, the question of what is central to being called an Adventist. And so I reflect on myself. I still consider myself an Adventist. The question for me then is why? And that's what today's presentation got me to reflect on, is why do I consider myself a Seventh-day Adventist? Given some of my beliefs, and I was reflecting some on our presentation last week about theodicy and how my resolution and thoughts about theodicy impact my overall theological beliefs, which could, to many, lead me to not see myself as an Adventist. And what I felt was missing today was this talk about there need to be things that we share, but not a discussion about the things that we do share, except a little bit. He talked a little bit about he mentioned the sanctuary. the Sabbath, the great controversy theme, and then mentioned vegetarianism, but not and then said that's not one. Even though he mentioned the Sabbath, he did talk about the diversity of ways that we keep the Sabbath. And so again, within any of these shared things, there's a lot of diversity within the unity. If it was sanctuary, Sabbath, and great controversy theme, I would be a ghostly Seventh-day Adventist. For me, there's the Advent part, and certainly the seventh day. I enjoy my Sabbath. That's part of me. So I am a seventh-day person, and I would say that I'm an Adventist, believing in the second coming, looking forward to the second coming. For those of you who were here last week, you'll recall that the one speaker who wasn't talking about the great controversy, but had a different view of theodicy, where he said that he had a hope of a resolution of evil, but he didn't think, he also thought that that might never happen. In other words, yeah. And that's,
he didn't have the certainty.
He didn't have a certainty. And that's where I would find myself. So I'm an uncertain Adventist, which is an interesting way. So maybe I'm a Seventh-day uncertain Adventist. Well, I think I'll stop with that and see if there's anyone else who has a comment. I don't have any hands though.
So Monty, when you look at yourself as your core identity as an Adventist, and let's say that core identity of an Adventist lands in a little church in Montana, would you still feel that you belong?
That's an interesting question. I would. I might disagree with a lot of the people I land with. Maybe not as much, maybe more Idaho than Montana. But I would probably disagree. I probably wouldn't agree with many of the beliefs of the people in that church. Although I would think that if that was the case and I didn't feel at home there, I would say that I would feel like that church was making themselves a room in the big tent that I see as the Adventist church for myself personally. And so I might not fit in their room, but that doesn't mean I don't fit in the tent of the Adventist church. And if that room was unhospitable enough, I would probably choose not to open the door and walk into that room. I see Peter has a hand up, and then let's come back to Rod.
Well, first of all, I'd like to mention that what David Trim gave us is just a summary of what happened during this conference for several days. And it's hard really to have a general view about what really happened there. But I like to stop and talk a little bit about two of the things that David Trim mentioned about how the Adventists are viewing different problems. Problem of Sabbath. He was mentioning that he was raised in Australia, not swimming in Sabbath and not playing soccer, or if was playing soccer, just you should not score goals. Well, he was kind of, I think, dismissive about these inherited customs during his childhood. I would like eventually somebody to give some suggestions then. If this was an exaggeration, how should we celebrate the Sabbath? And let me give you my view, how I see the celebration of the Sabbath. the Sabbath, in my view, should be celebrated between two points of view. One that is presented by Prophet Isaiah, when he's mentioning that you should not do your pleasures in Sabbath. And maybe here we should define what pleasure really means. And Jesus' view of the Sabbath when he said that the Sabbath was made for man, which in my view is that you should not burden the Sabbath, as the Jews did with all their 613 rules and regulations. But it didn't say anything about this. We didn't hear anything about that, just a theoretical, philosophical point of view, but not so much a practice. One good point of view that I took it that I agree with him was about progressive relativism. And he mentioned that we should stay on good traditional points of view of doctrine that we inherited, and be very cautious about the changes. And this, I believe, it's in view with what Apostle Peter was teaching us when he told us that we should not be carried by any wind of doctrine. That means that some of beliefs are things that should not be accepted. We should be very careful in accepting this. In regard to what the identity of Seventh-day Adventists should be, well, I was very surprised that they didn't look, because the Bible is giving us an example right in the beginning about the identity of a Christian, and through extension to a Seventh-day Adventist. We remember that the first council of Jerusalem was giving some instructions for the pagans what they should respect, what they should believe, and what they should practice. And I believe for us also, it's important to believe what the church is deciding, because in the pews, as somebody said, we should have all kinds of points of views, and then we'll be like during the Judges, when everybody was doing what was right in his own view. And this is anarchy. And we should be very careful. We are living in a very relativist society in which diversity, in my view, was creating a big damage for this nation. And that's the reason for which we are so divided these days, because the roots is in this promotion, strong promotion of diversity. I'm talking about diversity.
Sorry, Peter, could you define diversity, please?
Yes,
because
yes,
people have different.
I was about to. Diversity, I'm not against being, eating differently, cooking differently, wearing different clothes and things like that. I'm talking about a core belief. And this nation was based on a core belief. And to have a nation, we should stand with this, because otherwise it will be tribal, anarchy. And in the church, we should do the same. That's a core belief that we should all rally against and believe in. And of course, we have a lot, we should discuss a lot about which are these core beliefs. This could be another discussion.
Well, maybe thank you, but maybe as a comment, I think that our core beliefs have changed and evolved over time. And I mean, the core beliefs that I was baptized into were much, much fewer than they are today. So what exactly is core and who is deciding? And I think there is also the issue of present truth that is important for our church. Is our church's identity was built on present truth, on the fact that we are capable of looking at new evidence and finding new ways. And so the moment we become encapsulated and kind of fixed into a doctrinal view of what truth is, maybe the day when our church dies, because we have always been more of a movement and less than kind of doctrine based group of believers. And I think this has been true from the very beginning of our church. And I believe that if we got rid of that, we are actually losing a bit of our identity.
Well, we are believing in a postmodern society in which is a very relativistic society. And this postmodern society doesn't agree too much with what Jesus said when he said, "You will know the truth and the truth will make you free."
Yes, but who defines the truth?
Let me finish this. And the reason for this postmodern society is not believing in what Jesus said is that this truth of Jesus is not including so many diverse ideas, that everybody has his own truth. Well, we believe, personally, I still believe that when Jesus said, "You will know the truth," and the truth that he was presenting is still actual for our days. And in regard to the present truth that you're mentioning, is that, yes, there are some things that I believe in our traditional Adventists are still valuable. And of course, I agree that the truth is evolving. But my point of view was that we should be very cautious in accepting new points of doctrine, because that will create serious problems. And that's the way in which the heresies enter into the church. Because there are so many, so many came with so many different ideas. Some of them were very, very strange ideas.
All right. Thank you, Peter. I think that's an interesting and good point. I want to hear what Rod has to say. Then
Can I make my last point?
One more point, yes.
Yes. And in regard to the point that was the question that Zach asked about the future of Adventism. David Trim mentioned that telling the stories, the way we are telling the stories. Well, I believe that there is a different thing very important for Adventists to stay on, to maintain it. And that is the centrality of Jesus Christ. And I believe that we are living today in a society in which the importance of Christ is kind of diminished. And we have different ways of reaching God. And Jesus Christ said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. And nobody comes to the Father and just through me." And I believe this. This is the most important thing that we should maintain, the centrality of Jesus Christ in our salvation.
Thank you, Peter. So, yeah, you're a Seventh-day Adventist Christian.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Rod, you're up. And Rod, I think we'll have you be the last person in the queue. And after your comment, we'll turn it back over to Simona to wrap things up for us.
Okay. Peter, in many ways, is just making my point about the interpretive nature of these core beliefs and the selection of them. In my foundational beliefs, in my rebuild, I go back to James White, and there were three. And to Peter's point, the first thing, and the words that we used were the adequacy, the righteousness of Jesus and the adequacy of Jesus. And so we can call it being he's central to our beliefs, but it's not just that he's central, it's that his righteousness was adequate for salvation. The second belief was the whole Sabbath platform. And the third belief was the vision of a world in need, and a world in need of a peculiar message, a special message. And that's where James White based his foundational beliefs when this argument or debate came up. And I thought if it's good enough for James at the beginning, then it's foundational for me. I just want to share that when I was a young man, I did a lot of travel to unusual places. And probably the greatest delight in that time was going to a Seventh-day Adventist church that I could find when I got off a cruise ship or I got off a plane. And the absolute delight to walk into a Seventh-day Adventist church and be welcomed, you know, even as a white person, as an unknown person, as a young man, and be taken home to various places for dinner and lunch and to join in with families. Even before a word of theology was spoken, I could feel that oneness, that welcomeness, and it's still one of the greatest joys of my life and my reflection. There was just this knowing, you know, that the mere fact that I walked through the door and sat down in the pew it messaged everybody in there that, hey, this guy, we don't know who he is, but we know he's one of us, and we're going to be kind and gracious to him. That is part of the power and joy of being part of a worldwide community. Now, just quickly, last week, and this could be something we could come back on in another Sabbath school, but that was a very rich presentation last week. But I just want to quickly share that in part of my reflections was I was very impressed with both the speakers and more inclined to lean towards the gentleman or the Nazarene speaker. And he seemed so delighted and casual and joyful in our midst. But towards the end, when I asked him a couple of questions and other people asked him questions, he described himself as an atheist and probably an agnostic. He did say that he said, I have this deep intuitive belief that there is a kind God. And that's a track that I could, and I think many others could relate to, was in spite of all the theological debate, what he can't shake is this very deep intuitive belief that there is a God yet for him to understand. But when he got into dismissing large cornerstones of Christian beliefs, such as, I think I asked about the divine counsel, which is very biblical, he waved that off as being an additive. He waved off the fall. He quickly reached out to pass that, you know, in a long history of evolution. But if you start to, my point is this: as I started to reflect what he had rejected, I found him less compelling. I didn't want to go on his journey. His journey had no interest for me. I don't want to end up an atheist nihilist. The other hand was a guy, I think his name was Pelham. I thought he was very well organized, a little intense, but he was a very smart guy, and I enjoyed his presentation. And I just came out of there feeling somewhat more that he offered me more stability. The cornerstones were still in place, and so I would just want to share that I changed over the week in my reflections of who I was leaning towards, and I want to go and read more about Pelham. I think the other thing is had to do with Simona's expression on present truth, and that is something that we will, I know, continue to discuss and debate, because that concept is not going to go away. But I do note that young people, the last 2 or 3 generations, have little interest in doctrinal frameworks, and we were a very doctrinal church. But the drop-off of churchgoers, even in the last 2 or 3 years, is just dramatic. I don't know what's going to reverse that, but it just seems that the current generation of young people through to 30 years old really have little to no interest in doctrinal frameworks. I'll just leave it there.
All right, Rodney, thank you very much. And thank you for your reflections on traveling around the world and being able to drop into a church and feeling at home. I think that's, I think, a good story, as well as a good picture for us to cap off this Sabbath school discussion today. To me, that means a lot in the context of this, the broader discussion. Back to you, Simone, to wrap things up for us.
Thank you, Monty, and thank you, everybody. So for today's reading, I have chosen a quote from Buchner. It says this: "Loving God means rejoicing in Him. It means trusting Him when you can think of 100 reasons not to trust anything. It means praying to Him even when you don't feel like it. It means watching for Him in the beauty and sadness and gladness and mystery of your own life and of life around you. Loving each other doesn't mean loving each other in some sentimental, unrealistic greeting card kind of way, but the way families love each other, even though they may fight tooth and nail and get fed up to the teeth with each other and drive each other crazy, yet all the time know deep down in their hearts that they belong to each other and need each other and can't imagine what life would be without each other, even the ones they often wish had never been born." And I think this is an important part, you know, without the love, all these things that make us different would be something that would divide us. And I think God is inviting us to love each other, regardless where we stand.
Thank you,
And for our benediction and for a prayer, I'm drawing on a traditional Easter prayer. Draw us forth, God of all creation. Draw us forward and away from limited certainty into the immense world of your love. Give us the capacity to, even for a moment, taste the richness of the feast you give us. Give us the peace to live with uncertainty, with questions, with doubts. Help us to experience the resurrection anew, with open wonder and an increasing ability to see you in the people of Easter. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Beautiful.